I could have started this video with an intro about some recent SpaceX Starship news or developments in NASA's Artemis program, and how I decided to make this video to capitalize on the extreme excitement generated by the NASA press release blog, and then segued into the fact that the Saturn V is still the most powerful rocket ever launched. But seeing as how the folder of B-roll for this video is nearly 2 years old at this point, it would have been pulled straight out of thin air, making this video as authentic as it is on time. The phrase, most powerful rocket ever launched, could either mean the greatest payload capacity or the greatest amount of thrust produced. I'll be using the second one since it's both simpler and more relevant to what I want to talk about in this video. The reason the Saturn V is so powerful is because of its 5 Rockedyne F-1 engines. Now, the Rockedyne F-1 is a regeneratively cooled open-cycle engine. It is also the most powerful single combustion chamber rocket engine ever built. And if that sounds like a lot of rocket science terms, here's what that all means. Like most very powerful rocket engines, the F-1 has 2 liquid propellants. In its case, these are liquid oxygen and RP1, which is basically very fancy kerosene. The liquid oxygen is the oxidizer, and the fancy kerosene is the fuel. And these two are burned in a engine nozzle, the giant conical part that I imagine most people think of as the actual rocket engine, to produce thrust. However, in order to produce an actually useful amount of thrust, the fuel and oxidizer can't just have pipes running to the engine nozzle and be fed like a sink. They need to be actively pumped into the engine nozzle. And in order to do this, the F-1 has a pump and generator system. There is a pump that forces along the oxidizer and fuel, and it is powered by a generator that is fed by the oxidizer and fuel. And because of this reason, the pump is actually just gravity fed or pressure fed like a sink. It can only start on the ground. The F-1 engine basically can only start at 0. Since it was designed as a first-stage engine, it would never have to deal with the problem of starting in orbit. And the pump only uses a little tiny bit of oxidizer and fuel, so it has very little effect on the actual efficiency of the engine. However, there is another problem. The heat from the kerosene liquid oxygen reaction produces so much heat that it can actually melt the metal alloy that the engine nozzle of the F-1 is made out of. So in order to counter this, the kerosene is actually run in a series of pipes around the edge of the rocket nozzle, and this cools it off enough due to the extremely high flow rate, thanks to the pump, of the kerosene. And after it circles the engine nozzle a few times, it then goes to the combustion chamber, on the inside this time. And to help keep the engine nozzle at least a little bit cool, or cool long enough so that it works for the few minutes that the engine is going to be running, the exhaust from the generator is actually piped into the nozzle, where it creates sort of a cold gas film around the inside, providing just a little bit of insulation from the very hot engine exhaust. So that is what open cycle and regeneratively cooled refers to. And hopefully the single combustion chamber part also makes more sense now. It is one pump and generator system that leads to one engine nozzle. There are rocket engines that are more powerful than the F1, but they have one pump and generator system that leads to multiple engine nozzles. The Soviet RD-170 is an example of this. It had one pump control system, and that led to a 2x2 grid of combustion chambers. And the reason that it was built that way was because the sound generated by a very large combustion chamber, like what the F1 has, is actually enough to shake a engine nozzle apart. And Rockedyne got around this by adding basically sound dampeners along the inside of the engine. This did, however, have the effect of taking away space of fuel injectors, which meant that the engine was less powerful. The RD-170 didn't have this problem due to the much smaller combustion chambers, and so didn't waste as much space on the inside of the combustion chamber dealing with the sound of the rocket. Now, there are actually multiple versions of the F-1 engine. The F-1 itself was used in the Apollo program for the Saturn V rockets. The F-1A was constructed for later Apollo-like missions and later Saturn rockets, but was never actually flown to space. It was only ever test-fired, and it was about the same efficiency and about 20% higher thrust. And then the F-1B was created actually rather recently. It was designed as part of the NASA Space Launch System program. The idea was to create a potential alternative, or at least attempt to create an alternative, to the solid rocket boosters that were going to be carried over from the space shuttle missions as the side boosters for the SLS rockets. And the reason that the F-1 was considered was that it is actually the only engine in NASA history that produced enough thrust to be used. However, the blueprints that exist for the F-1s are not actually very accurate to the engines themselves. And this is because the engineers who assembled the engines had to make so many modifications and tweaks in the process of getting them to work properly that the blueprints are basically prototype versions of the engines. And there are no blueprints for the finished engines themselves. And the changes that the engineers made were stored basically in their heads. So rather than go through and figure out how to assemble F-1s as they actually were, NASA reverse engineered the rockets entirely, creating a F-1-like engine with about 1/5 the number of parts, about 15% more thrust than the F-1A, and nearly 20% higher efficiency. And the reason that these changes could be made is that material technology since the early 1960s has advanced significantly. And this means, mainly, that the regenerative cooling system is no longer needed, since we now have metal alloys that are capable of withstanding the temperature of kerosene liquid oxygen reactions. Thus, the whole vented generator gas system and the regenerative cooling pipe system are no longer needed. The reduced complexity and the reduced weight from chopping these bits off the engine are responsible for making them both lighter and more efficient, since there's just less that needs to happen inside the engine for it to work. However, after having Rockedyne design the F-1B, NASA ended up using the solid rocket boosters from the space shuttle missions as the side boosters for the SLS program. This is partially due to NASA politics, partially due to cost, and also a bit due to they already have the mounting systems for the orange tanks. However, fortunately, after all the engineering that went into them, the F-1B is not actually going to go to waste. because since they've already manufactured a bunch of them, they're going to be used as the second stage engine for the SLS program, basically the bit up here. So, as the decades have passed, as rocket engineering has changed over time, the course of the F1B through it all, the course of the F1 through it all is basically that it has gone from being down here in the rocket to being up here in the rocket. And that is the history and basic engineering of the F1 rocket engine. Thank you for watching.